In the lands of the north, where the black rocks stand guard against the cold sea, in the dark night that is very long, the men of the Northlands sit by their great log fires, and they tell a tale. They tell old, terrible tales of the days before the city of the Nogs was built, when the long valleys between the mountains, which are now fields where gentle cows are grazing, were dark, deep forests, below the reach of the sun, where lurked some strange, unlovely beasts. Of all the forests, none was so dark and deep as the wood they called Trolldisco. None was so dangerous as Trolldisco, for it was the domain of the terrible one-faced king, whom nobody had ever seen, or lived to tell that they had seen. The castle of the one-faced king waited in the middle of the forest, like a spider in a dark web. The one-faced king did not need to leave his castle to find his victims, for the wood was populated by his subjects, the heavy, two-faced trolls that trod the twisted paths of the wood and lured innocent travellers to the king's castle and their death. Of all the beasts that lived in the forest, none were stranger or uglier than the two-faced trolls of Trolldisco. So it came to pass that the Nogs decided they must do battle with the one-faced king, and rid themselves of his menacing presence. Their prince in those days was young and fearless, and his name was Noggin. He was the 9th great-grandfather of the Noggin we know. He and 8 of his warriors disguised themselves as simple travellers, and set off to journey through the forest of Trolldisco. They heard the groaning and sniffling of the trolls as they made their way through the dark twisted paths of the dark twisted forest, but they did not see them. The sound was strange enough to strike fear into the heart of any traveller, and send him running headlong down the path towards the castle. So the Nogs made a great show of fear, and ran until they saw the light of the castle before them. When they came to the castle gate, they beat on it with their fists, crying and shouting to be let in and saved from the fierce trolls. The Nog's encounter with the one-faced king was short and swift. He had much magic at his command, but he was no match for Noggin, who wore the stone of Nudrug on his ring and wielded a greater magic power than any troll king. They fought as lions and eagles, serpents and dragons, but in the end the Troll King was bound by his own magic and cast into the great dry well in the centre of his castle, where lay the rotting bones of his many victims. In the castle the Nogs found great treasure of gold and silver and weapons, which the Troll King had stolen from the travellers he had murdered. They rejoiced, and loaded the treasure into sacks, ready to carry away. When they opened the great gate of the castle, they rejoiced no longer. The trolls had heard the cries of their king, and although they did not dare enter the castle, many of the stone monsters had gathered around the castle and were waiting for the Nogs to come out. The Nogs could not fight the trolls, and the stone of Nudrug, powerful though it is, can only be used against other magic. At first it seemed to the Nogs that they were besieged, but the stone trolls were simple monsters and slow of thought. By pretending to leave by another of the 4 doors of the castle, the Nog warriors lured the trolls away from one side of the castle. Then with much noise they left from the front door, while Noggin waited and slipped out the back door with the treasure. Through all the dark woods the Nogs played their intricate, dangerous game, until at last Noggin saw the light of day at the edge of the forest, and with a great shout of "Toot-i-Nog!" the Nogs rushed to safety. That is the old and terrible tale, and some say one day the one-faced king will burst forth with a terrible cry, and wreak his vengeance over all the land. But nobody takes much notice of stories like that, except Thornogson, who believes anything frightening. Many, many years had passed since those dreadful deeds were done. Kings had lived and died in the Northlands, and now Noggin the Nog was king. The land had changed greatly. The castle was ruined, but still standing. It stood in a grove of dark trees, which was all that remained of the great forest. It was a pleasant place for a picnic on a summer's day, but at night it still seemed quite fearful, and people kept away. The reign of Noggin the Nog was peaceful at that time. Even his wicked uncle, The banished Nogbad the Bad had quietly returned from exile and taken up residence in his ruined castle, and was keeping brown bears. There were no wars or dragons to fight any more, so the Nogs were peaceful farmers and fishermen. In their spare time they told stories and played games. Olaf the Lofty, the court inventor, was very clever at making up games. He thought of a marvellous game, which was based on the old story of the Troll King. It was played on the paved courtyard of the castle, which Olaf had marked out in squares. Noggin himself and 8 of his warriors had to stand on squares, surrounded by local tradesmen, who Olaf had persuaded to play the trolls. Olaf wasn't sure of the rules, and he capered about among them, reading from his scroll and muttering to himself. Sometimes he moved one of the players to a different square, but most of the time they just stood there and shivered. The sun was setting when Olaf at last announced that he had worked out the rules and the game was ready to be played. Even as he spoke, there came a clap of thunder, and heavy raindrops began to fall. In spite of Olaf's objections, the players took shelter. By the time the rain had stopped, it was dark. Early in the morning, the Charnogs arrived with buckets and mops to clean the castle. They removed the last traces of Olaf's chalk marks. The game was not lost, however, for Olaf is an inventor. He came rushing into Noggin's presence, carrying a piece of wood and a bag of stones. "We don't need the courtyard," he shouted. "Oh, don't we?" said Noggin, looking out of the window to make sure Olaf hadn't removed it. "We don't need you and the warriors," he shouted. "Oh, don't we?" said Noggin, rather surprised. "Who will be king of the Nogs then?" "These," shouted Olaf, and he tipped the bag of stones onto the piece of wood. As you have probably guessed, Olaf was talking about his game. "See, the board is marked with squares. It is the king's board. I call it Hneftafl," said Olaf. "These green stones are trolls, while these white stones are the warriors, and this tall stone is Noggin. Oh yes, and the flattened green jewel stone is the one-faced king." "Very interesting," said Noggin. "But what do you do with it?" "It's marvellous," said Olaf. "We don't need to stand outside and move about the squares in the courtyard to play the game. We can sit here and play it by moving the pieces on the board." "That is truly a marvellous idea," said Noggin. And forthwith he and Olaf sat down on each side of the king's board and played Hneftafl. It was a good game, and Noggin was good at it, which pleased him a lot. Many Nogs took up the game, and soon the craftsmen of the town were making carved wooden boards and delicate carved stone and ivory pieces, in the form of heroic Nog warriors and ugly green trolls. Contests and Hneftafl championships were arranged and played. Of all the Nogs who played, there were none who could defeat Noggin. They did not deliberately let him win, just because he was king. That's not the way of the Nogs. Noggin was just too clever and skillful at the game. Alas, to be too good at the game brought, in the end, its own disappointment. Soon the time came when nobody seemed to want to play Hneftafl with Noggin, because they knew he would win. Poor Noggin sat in the window of his castle tower and tried to play the game against himself. "Oh, it's no good," he said, sadly. "I always know what I'm going to do next." Suddenly, with a scuffle of feathers and a thump, a large crow landed on the window-sill. "Crack!" it said, and tipped its head to one side. "And the same to you," said Noggin. "Crackly!" said the crow, and tipped its head the other way. "Do you happen to play Hneftafl?" asked Noggin, hopefully. The crow hopped along on one leg and looked closely at the board. For a moment, Noggin thought it was wondering whether to play Hneftafl, but he was wrong. The crow held out its other leg and dropped a tiny rolled-up scroll on the board. Noggin picked it up and unrolled it. It read the words, "I'll be the trolls, and I'll beat you." The message was signed with a spiky letter N, but Noggin already knew who had sent it. Nobody but Nogbad used crows as messengers. "Just a moment, please," said Noggin politely to the crow. "Do help yourself to a biscuit, or some cheese." Noggin found a writing quill and some ink, and penned a reply on the back of Nogbad's message. He wrote the words, "All right. Where? When?" He gave the scroll to the crow, who swallowed its biscuit, croaked once rudely, and humped itself clumsily into the air. Noggin was willing, even eager to play Neftafel with Nogbad, but he couldn't really invite Nogbad to come to the castle, nor could he himself go to Nogbad's castle, because Nogbad was still supposed to be banished. In fact, he was only allowed to stay in his castle because Noggin pretended not to notice he was there. Nogbad's reply came swiftly. The crow thumped on the windowsill. "Caw!" it said, in a rather exhausted voice. "You must be tired," said Noggin. "Do have a few raisins, or some nuts." Noggin unrolled the tiny scroll the bird had brought. It read the words, "Tomorrow afternoon, beside the Troll King's castle." Noggin hesitated. He wasn't sure he liked the idea of playing that particular game in that particular place. Still, he wasn't going to show Nogbad that he was nervous. He took up his pen and wrote the words, "See you there." Noggin handed the scroll to the bird. "Don't hurry, old bird. Do wait till you're rested." "Caw!" said the crow impatiently, and flew off to Nogbad. So the challenge was made and taken. Soon it would be time for the contest. It could not be a big affair with trumpets and a master of ceremonies, but Noggin was not so foolish as to go alone. He took Thor Nogson and 4 members of the Royal Guard with him, and, well, you know how these things happen. Quite a lot of other Nogs heard about what was going on and turned up to watch. In the bright afternoon sun, the Troll King's castle in the grove of dark trees seemed a pleasant shady spot for a picnic. Queen Nuka had made a big bag of honey sandwiches for them, and the Royal Guard had brought a large jar of mead and a small folding table. In front of the castle, in the green shade of the arcing trees, there was a patch of grass with 2 square stones lying on it. Thor Nogson set up the table between the stones. He set out the board and the pieces, and the sandwiches, and the mead. "There you are, Noggin," said Thor Nogson. "Everything is set up and ready. What do we do now?" "We wait for Nogbad," said Noggin. "No need, no need," said a voice from inside the ruined castle. The voice was Nogbad's. He stepped from behind the broken buttresses and bowed. "Ah, good," he said. "Everything is ready for the battle, I see, and you have brought an army with you as well." "Oh, just for company, and to see fair play," explained Noggin. "Fair indeed," chuckled Nogbad. "I'm sure it won't be necessary." So Noggin, King of the Nogs, and his wicked uncle sat down to play the game of Neftafel. It was a long game. Both the players were determined to win, so they took a long time deciding each move. For the Nog warriors and other Nogs who had come to watch, it was a very dull game. So slow was it, indeed, that the red sun began to climb down behind the mountains as if it too were tired of waiting. Very slowly the light faded and darkness began to fall. Very slowly, one by one, the watchers turned, and muttering excuses about having to shut up the chickens or feed the rabbits, wandered away. To tell the truth, they were frightened. Without the warmth of the sun and the light of the day, the place began to take on an atmosphere of twisted, dark, unknown menace that had made it so terrifying in the past. Thor Nogson was terrified, but, being a brave soldier, he did not show his fear. He lit a torch of rushes and held it aloft to light the players. All the while his eyes searched the darkness outside the ring of light from his torch, and his teeth chattered or nibbled his fingernails. Neither Noggin nor Nogbad seemed to have noticed the passage of time. They were intent on the game. The night was dark. A thin slice of new moon and a few stars were all that lit the sky. A chill breeze blew, and in the black grove all around Thor Nogson there was rustling and crackling, and sounds like large animals, or even trolls moving. At last the game came near its end. Noggin moved a piece and said the warning word, "Ute Nog." In the game, that meant that Nogbad could not stop him by moving one of his troll pieces to block his way. Noggin had won. Nogbad hissed with rage. All in the dark around them, the noises grew louder, and Thor Nogson was sure he could see the glint of damp stone moving in the torchlight. Nogbad made his move. He rose to his feet. "Trolls!" he snarled. "They have come!" As he spoke, the ugly shape slowly rocked and slowly moved forward into the light. "Run!" shouted Nogbad. "Run! The trolls are here!" He grabbed Thor Nogson and pushed him aside. "Run, you fool!" he shouted, and ripping the torch from Thor Nogson's hand, he rushed blindly away through the undergrowth. "Here, bring that light back!" shouted Thor Nogson, and he ran after Nogbad. Noggin, I am sorry to say, had wasted a few seconds of precious time. He moved his last piece and said the triumphant word, "Tootin' Nog," to show that he had won the game. Only then did he turn and pay attention to the commotion about him. He saw Nogbad disappearing into the distance, carrying the torch, Thor Nogson in close pursuit. In the pale moonlight that filtered through the trees, he dimly saw the large, smooth shapes of the trolls as they humped themselves towards him. The game was very far from won. Noggin backed away towards the castle walls. "Help!" he shouted. "Thor Nogson! Guards! Help!" Help, at that moment, seemed very far away. As the slow trolls moved relentlessly forward, the nearest Nog was Thor Nogson at the edge of the grove, grappling with Nogbad for the torch. "Noggin is dead!" cried Nogbad. "The trolls have killed him! I am your king!" "No, you're not!" shouted Thor Nogson. And he bumped Nogbad on the helmet with his sword, to keep him quiet. One warrior was still there, a young chap called Eric. Thor Nogson called him, and together they turned and ran back to the forest to rescue their king. The torch was nearly burnt out by now. Thor Nogson held it high to light the grassy path where the game had been played. They saw the table, the board and pieces, the pile of honey sandwiches, and the jar of mead. There was no sign of Noggin or the trolls. "Good mead this is," said Eric, helping himself. "Honey sandwiches too." "No time for that," said Thor Nogson. "Noggin, where are you?" "I'm here," came a faint voice from inside the castle. Thor Nogson ran towards the castle, tripped over the step, and banged the torch on the ground. Eric moved more carefully. He took a handful of honey sandwiches and followed his captain into the dark, ruined castle. The great hall of the castle had no roof, and in the center of the floor was a round hole, the dry well where, according to the story, the Troll King threw the bones of his victims. The moonlight showed them this, but it showed no trolls and no sign of Noggin. "Where are you?" called Thor Nogson. "Down here," answered Noggin. "In the well." As Thor Nogson approached the edge of the well, there came a rustling in the shadows, and from behind the stones and buttresses, the dark shapes of the trolls began to move. They formed a ring behind Thor Nogson, as if to edge him into the well. "Eric!" shouted Thor Nogson. "Stop them! How can we stop them?" "They like honey sandwiches," said Eric. Eric was throwing honey sandwiches in front of the trolls, who were scuffling and sniffing, and scooping them up. He threw some of the trolls beside Thor Nogson, and they turned away to pick them up. Thor Nogson ran outside and picked up the whole pile of sandwiches. He put them on the floor in the great hall. The trolls turned over backwards and sat in a ring around the sandwiches. "Help yourselves," said Thor Nogson to the trolls. Even in the dim moonlight, it was obvious that the trolls were brown bears in disguise. "Hi, what about me?" shouted Noggin. "We'll save you some," said Thor Nogson. "No, silly, I want to get out," shouted Noggin. Getting Noggin out was no easy task, but Eric fetched a rope, and the bears, once freed from their heavy troll-like covers, were very willing to help, and with the rope hooked to their harnesses, they soon hauled Noggin out. "It was smelly down there," he said, and shuddered. By the time dawn began to lighten in the east, Nogbad had recovered, and was beating on the great door of Noggin's castle, demanding to be admitted by the Council of Elders, and proclaimed king. By the time the sleepy Council of Elders had been assembled in their nightshirts in the courtyard, and were listening to Nogbad telling them what a good king he was going to be, and what marvellous new taxes he was going to invent, a strange-looking procession was making its way up the path to the castle. 3 tired Nogs, and 6 brown bears. "I am your king! I am king of the Nogs! Rejoice!" cried Nogbad the Bad. Nobody seemed to want to rejoice. "Rejoice, I say!" snarled Nogbad. "I don't think they want to rejoice," said Noggin the Nog. "I don't think anybody is pleased to see you, except your bears. See 'em off, bears." The bears seemed anxious to see Nogbad, but he didn't seem anxious to meet them. He ran for his life, away up the hill towards his black castle, and the bears ran close behind. "Good morning, everybody," said Noggin. "I'm back. I won the game." Then there was rejoicing and cheering as the people of the Northlands greeted their king.